The heavy metal door slammed shut behind Elena Rodriguez as two guards pushed her into the cold, windowless room. Her military uniform was torn and dirty, dark stains marking where shrapnel had cut through fabric and flesh during her last mission. The bandages wrapped around her left arm were already turning red, and she could feel the sting of untreated wounds across her back. The blacksite facility looked like something from a nightmare. Gray concrete walls stretched up to a ceiling she could barely see in the dim light. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with something darker that made her stomach turn. This wasn't a regular military prison. This was the kind of place where people disappeared and were never heard from again. Elena had been unconscious when they brought her here 3 days ago. She remembered the explosion that had torn through her convoy in the mountains of Afghanistan. She remembered the screaming of her team members and the taste of blood in her mouth. But everything after that was a blur until she woke up in this concrete box with no windows and no explanation. The guards who brought her food twice a day never spoke to her. They would slide a metal tray through a slot in the door and walk away without making eye contact. The food was barely edible, some kind of gray paste that tasted like cardboard mixed with salt. Elena forced herself to eat it anyway. She needed to stay strong for whatever was coming next. On her second day, she heard voices in the hallway outside her cell. The guards were talking to someone, their voices low but not quiet enough to hide their words completely. She pressed her ear against the cold metal door and listened carefully. "Look at her," one guard said with a laugh that made Elena's skin crawl, "all beat up and crying like a baby. These female soldiers think they're so tough until they get a few scratches. Did you see how she was begging for medical attention yesterday?" Another voice added. "Pathetic. My grandmother could handle pain better than that." Elena pulled back from the door, her hands clenched into fists. She hadn't been crying, and she certainly hadn't been begging. The pain from her wounds was terrible, but she had endured much worse during her years of service. These guards didn't know anything about her, but they had already decided she was weak. The mocking continued throughout the week. Every time the guards passed her cell, they would make comments loud enough for her to hear. They called her names that questioned her courage and her right to wear the uniform. They laughed about how she probably got her team killed because she wasn't strong enough to lead them properly. Helena tried to ignore their words, but each insult felt like another wound. She had spent 15 years proving herself in a military that didn't always welcome women. She had earned every rank, every medal, every bit of respect through blood, sweat, and determination. Now she was trapped in this place, treated like she was nothing more than a failure. What the guards didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez wasn't just any soldier. Her real identity was buried so deep in classified files that even most generals didn't know the truth. The scars covering her body weren't from one failed mission. They were the result of dozens of successful operations that had saved thousands of lives and changed the course of conflicts around the world. Elena closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that always came flooding back when she was alone, the faces of enemies she had eliminated to protect innocent people. The sound of helicopters coming to extract her from impossible situations. The weight of secrets she carried that could never be shared with anyone. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, she was just another prisoner in a place that wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a broken woman who couldn't handle the pressures of war. As night fell and the facility grew quiet, Elena began to plan. She studied every sound, every pattern, every detail of her surroundings. The guards thought she was weak, but they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. She had survived things that would destroy most people, and she wasn't going to let a few ignorant guards be the end of her story. The wounds on her body were healing slowly without proper medical care, but her mind was sharp as ever. Elena Rodriguez had been underestimated before, and it had never ended well for the people who made that mistake. This time would be no different. 2 weeks had passed since Elena's arrival at the blacksite, and the mockery from the guards had only gotten worse. They had started bringing other personnel to look at her through the small window in her door, pointing and laughing like she was some kind of zoo animal. The guards would tell exaggerated stories about how she had supposedly broken down and begged for mercy during her capture. "You should have seen her," Guard Patterson would say to anyone who would listen, "crying and screaming like a little girl when we found her. All that tough military training and she falls apart the moment things get real." Elena sat on the thin mattress in her cell, her back against the wall, listening to their lies with growing anger. The truth was that she had been unconscious when they found her, buried under the wreckage of her destroyed vehicle. There had been no crying, no begging, no breakdown. But the guards seemed to enjoy creating their own version of events. What bothered Elena most wasn't the lies themselves, but the fact that these men had no idea who they were dealing with. If they knew her real identity, they would be treating her very differently. But her cover was so deep, so carefully constructed, that even her own military record showed her as nothing more than a mid-level intelligence officer with a clean but unremarkable service history. The real Elena Rodriguez had a different story entirely. She was the ghost that enemy forces whispered about in fearful voices around their campfires. She was the shadow that appeared in the night to eliminate high-value targets that conventional forces couldn't touch. She was the woman who had single-handedly prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent people. But those missions were so classified that they didn't officially exist. The medals she had earned for them were locked away in a vault that only a handful of people even knew about. As far as the world was concerned, Elena Rodriguez was just another soldier doing her job. The isolation was starting to wear on her. Elena had always been comfortable working alone, but this was different. This wasn't a mission with a clear objective and an exit strategy. This was imprisonment with no end in sight and no communication with the outside world. She didn't even know if anyone was looking for her, or if her disappearance had been written off as another casualty of war. During her 3rd week in the facility, something changed. Elena was lying on her mattress when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her cell. These weren't the heavy boots of the guards she had grown used to. These steps were different, more measured and purposeful. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and Elena heard the sound of keys turning in multiple locks. The door opened slowly, and a man in a crisp military uniform stepped into her cell. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in seconds. Behind him stood 2 guards that Elena hadn't seen before. These men were different from the others. They stood at attention with the bearing of professional soldiers, not the casual arrogance of the guards who had been tormenting her. "Ms. Rodriguez," the older man said in a voice that carried clear authority, "I am Colonel James Harrison. I apologize for the conditions you've been subjected to during your stay here." Elena studied his face carefully. There was something in his expression that suggested he knew more about her situation than he was letting on. She remained silent, waiting to see what he would reveal. "I understand that some of our personnel have been less than professional in their treatment of you," Harrison continued. "That ends now. You will be moved to more appropriate quarters while we sort out your situation." "What situation?" Elena asked, speaking for the first time in days. Her voice was hoarse from lack of use, but steady. Harrison glanced at the guards behind him and then back at Elena. "There seems to have been some confusion about your identity and your presence here. We're working to clarify things with your command structure." Elena felt a flicker of hope, but she kept her expression neutral. In her experience, promises from unknown military officials were often worth less than the paper they weren't written on. But this Colonel Harrison seemed different from the guards who had been watching her. There was a respect in his manner that suggested he knew she was more than she appeared to be. "Will I be getting medical attention for my injuries?" Elena asked, gesturing to the bandages that had long since needed changing. "Immediately," Harrison replied. "A medic is waiting outside to examine you. After that, we'll get you cleaned up and properly fed." As Harrison turned to leave, Elena spoke again. "Colonel, how long have I been here?" Harrison paused in the doorway. 22 days, he said quietly. Far longer than should have been necessary. Something in his tone told Elena that there was much more to this story than a simple case of mistaken identity. But for now, the promise of medical care and better treatment was enough. She had survived worse situations by being patient and waiting for the right moment to act. As she was escorted from her cell for the first time in over 3 weeks, Elena couldn't help but notice how the guards who had been mocking her suddenly avoided making eye contact. Something had changed, and she was determined to find out what it was. Elena's new quarters were like stepping into a different world. Instead of the concrete box where she had spent nearly a month, she now had a proper room with a real bed, a desk, and even a small window that let in natural light. The medic had cleaned and properly bandaged her wounds, and for the first time since her capture, she felt almost human again. But Elena wasn't fooled by the improved treatment. She knew that intelligence facilities didn't upgrade prisoners' accommodations out of kindness. Something had happened to change her status, and she needed to figure out what it was. Colonel Harrison visited her every few days, always polite, but never revealing much information. He would ask about her comfort and whether she needed anything, but he carefully avoided discussing why she was there or when she might be released. Elena could tell he was stalling for time, waiting for something. The guards who brought her meals were different now, too. They were professional and respectful, a complete change from the mocking treatment she had received before. Elena noticed that these new guards wore different insignia on their uniforms, suggesting they came from a different unit entirely. On her 5th day in the new quarters, Elena was reading a book that had been provided when she heard raised voices in the hallway outside her room. She moved closer to the door and listened carefully. "I don't care what your orders were," a man's voice said angrily. "Do you have any idea who you've been holding here? Do you understand what kind of investigation this is going to trigger?" Elena didn't recognize the voice, but the tone was one of barely controlled fury. Someone was very upset about her situation. "Sir, we were following standard protocol," another voice replied. Elena recognized this one as Guard Patterson, the man who had led the mocking comments about her. He sounded nervous now, very different from his earlier arrogance. "Standard protocol?" the first voice shouted. "Standard protocol for handling a decorated war hero who has given 15 years of her life to this country? Standard protocol for treating someone who has saved more lives than you could count in a lifetime?" Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Someone knew who she really was. But how was that possible? Her real service record was supposed to be completely classified. "We didn't know, sir," Patterson said weakly. Her file showed her as a regular intelligence officer. There was nothing about any special service record. "Of course there was nothing in her regular file, you idiot," the unknown voice snapped. "Do you think we advertise the identities of our most valuable assets? Do you think we put their real accomplishments in files that any desk clerk can access?" Elena heard footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway. Whoever was out there was extremely agitated, and she was starting to understand why. "Tell me exactly how you treated her," the voice demanded, "and don't leave out any details." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Elena could picture Patterson trying to figure out how to explain weeks of mockery and humiliation without getting himself into serious trouble. We followed standard procedures for all prisoners," Patterson finally said. "That's not what I asked," the voice replied coldly. "I want to know exactly how you treated Elena Rodriguez. Did you mock her? Did you make jokes about her wounds? Did you laugh at her pain?" More silence. Elena realized that someone had been investigating her treatment, and Patterson was about to face the consequences of his actions. "Sir, we may have made some inappropriate comments," Patterson admitted reluctantly, "but we had no way of knowing what? That she deserved basic human dignity? That she was a fellow service member who had been injured in the line of duty? That she was entitled to respect regardless of who she was?" Elena heard a door slam somewhere down the hallway and then footsteps approaching her room. She quickly moved away from the door and sat down at the desk, pretending to read her book. A few moments later, there was a soft knock on her door. This was new. No one had knocked before entering since her arrival at the facility. "Come in," Elena called out. The door opened, and a man in a general's uniform stepped into her room. He was tall and imposing, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Elena had never met him before, but something about his bearing suggested this was someone very important. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said formally, "I am General Marcus Webb. I owe you a sincere apology for the treatment you have received at this facility." Elena studied his face carefully. This man knew exactly who she was, and from his expression he was genuinely angry about how she had been treated. "General," Elena replied, standing up, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure I understand what's happening here." Webb's expression softened slightly. "I imagine you're very confused. You've been held here for over a month under circumstances that should never have occurred. There was a breakdown in communication that led to your real identity being hidden from the personnel at this facility." "My real identity?" Elena asked, even though she was beginning to understand. "Elena Rodriguez," Webb said quietly. "Call sign Ghost, 15 years of classified operations, 3 prevented terrorist attacks, 47 high-value targets eliminated, 2 silver stars, 1 bronze star, and a Medal of Honor that officially doesn't exist. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. No one was supposed to know all of that information. Her entire career had been built on the principle that her real accomplishments would remain secret forever. "How do you know about my service record?" she asked. General Webb smiled grimly. "Because, Ms. Rodriguez, I'm the one who recommended you for most of those decorations. And I'm the one who's going to make sure that everyone who mistreated you here faces the full consequences of their actions." General Webb sat down across from Elena, his expression serious but respectful. For the first time in over a month, Elena felt like she was being treated as an equal rather than a prisoner. "I need to explain how this happened," Webb began. "When your convoy was attacked in Afghanistan, you were listed as missing in action. The local forces who found you at the crash site didn't know your real identity. They followed standard procedure and transferred you to this facility for debriefing." Elena nodded, beginning to understand the chain of events that had led to her imprisonment. "The problem," Webb continued, "is that your cover identity was so deep that even the intelligence officers here couldn't access your real files. As far as they knew, you were Elena Rodriguez, a mid-level analyst who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." "How did you find out I was here?" Elena asked. Webb's face darkened. "It took us 4 weeks to track you down. When you didn't check in after your mission, we assumed the worst. We had teams searching the mountains for your body. It wasn't until yesterday that someone thought to check the detention facilities." Elena felt a surge of anger. 4 weeks of being treated like dirt, because no one had bothered to check if she was alive and in custody. 4 weeks of mockery and humiliation that could have been avoided with a simple computer search. "The guards here," Webb said, his voice growing cold. "They've been treating you as if you were some kind of coward who broke down under pressure. They have no idea that you've done things that would give them nightmares." Elena thought about all the comments she had endured, all the laughter at her expense, all the jokes about her supposed weakness. The irony was almost too much to bear. "General, I can handle being disrespected," Elena said quietly. "What bothers me is that they have no idea what real soldiers go through. They sit in their safe facility and mock people who've actually bled for this country." Webb stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape surrounding the facility. "Tell me about your last mission," he said. "The one that brought you here." Elena hesitated. Even with General Webb, the details of her operations were supposed to remain classified, but she could see that he already knew most of the story. "We were tracking a cell that was planning to attack a school in Kabul," Elena began. 300 children would have died if we hadn't stopped them. We located their bomb-making facility in the mountains and moved in to neutralize the threat." Webb turned back to face her. "And? The intelligence was good, but they were expecting us," Elena continued. "They had rigged the entire building with explosives. We managed to eliminate the targets and secure the bomb-making materials, but they triggered the charges as we were leaving." Elena's voice grew quiet as she remembered the explosion. "My team. Most of them didn't make it out. I was thrown clear by the blast, but I was unconscious when the rescue teams arrived." 6 terrorists eliminated, Webb said. "Enough explosive material to level a city block secured. 300 children who got to go home to their families that night. And the people here treated you like a failure." Elena shrugged. "They don't know the story. To them, I'm just another casualty who survived when my team didn't." Webb walked back to his chair and sat down, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, sir. Do you want to press charges against the guards who mistreated you?" "What they did goes far beyond inappropriate comments. They subjected a decorated war hero to psychological torture based on their own ignorance and prejudice." Elena thought about this for a long moment. Part of her wanted to see Patterson and the others face consequences for their actions. They had made her feel worthless and weak when she was at her most vulnerable. They had mocked wounds she had received while saving innocent lives, but another part of her understood that these men were products of a system that didn't give them the information they needed to do their jobs properly. They were ignorant, not evil. "What would happen to them?" Elena asked. "Court-martial," Webb replied without hesitation. "Conduct unbecoming. Abuse of prisoners, violation of military code. They could face serious jail time and dishonorable discharge." Elena closed her eyes and thought about all the young soldiers she had known over the years. Good people who made bad decisions because they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. "General, I don't want to destroy their lives," Elena said finally. But I do want them to understand who they were dealing with. I want them to learn from this. Webb smiled for the first time since entering her room. That's exactly what I hoped you would say. It shows why you're the kind of person who deserves those medals, even if no one can ever know about them. What did you have in mind? Elena asked. Education, Webb replied. Those guards are going to learn exactly who Elena Rodriguez is and what she's done for this country. They're going to understand the weight of the service record they mocked, and they're going to spend the rest of their careers making sure nothing like this ever happens again. Elena nodded. It felt like justice without vengeance, consequences without destruction. There's one more thing, Webb said, standing up to leave. Your real service record is going to be partially declassified. Not the operational details, but enough to ensure that you get the recognition you deserve. No more hiding in the shadows, Elena. It's time for the world to know what kind of hero you really are. As General Webb left her room, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope that her sacrifices might finally be acknowledged. The next morning brought changes that Elena could never have imagined. Instead of the usual breakfast tray slipped through her door, she was escorted to a proper dining facility, where she sat at a table with real silverware and fresh food. The contrast with her previous treatment was so stark that it felt surreal. General Webb had kept his word about educating the facility staff. As Elena walked through the corridors, she noticed that the guards who had once mocked her now stood at attention when she passed. Their faces showed a mixture of shame and disbelief, as if they couldn't reconcile the woman they had tormented with the war hero they had been told about guard. Patterson was among the group that had been assembled for what Webb called mandatory education sessions. Elena learned later that these sessions involved detailed briefings about her service record, including graphic accounts of the missions she had completed and the lives she had saved. The transformation in Patterson was particularly striking. The man who had once laughed about her supposed weakness now couldn't make eye contact with her. When their paths crossed in the hallway, he would press himself against the wall as if trying to disappear entirely. Colonel Harrison visited Elena that afternoon with news about her departure from the facility. You'll be leaving here tomorrow morning, he told her. General Webb has arranged for you to be transferred to a medical facility in Germany for proper treatment of your injuries, followed by a full debriefing at the Pentagon. Elena was relieved to finally have an end date for her imprisonment, but she found herself curious about what would happen to the guards who had mistreated her. Colonel, what's going to happen to Patterson and the others? She asked. Harrison's expression was carefully neutral. They're being reassigned to different duties. Patterson specifically has been transferred to a training facility where he'll be working with new recruits, teaching them about respect for fellow service members and the importance of treating all military personnel with dignity. Elena smiled at the irony. The man who had mocked her would now spend his days teaching others not to make the same mistakes he had made. He requested the transfer himself, Harrison continued. Apparently, learning about your service record had quite an impact on him. He said he wanted to make sure no other soldier ever went through what you experienced here. That evening, Elena was walking in the small exercise yard that had been made available to her when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Patterson approaching, his head down and his hands clasped behind his back. Ma'am, he said quietly when he reached her. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I was hoping I could speak with you. Elena studied his face. The arrogance and casual cruelty that had defined their previous interactions were completely gone. In their place was something that looked like genuine remorse. What did you want to say? Elena asked. Patterson took a deep breath before speaking. I wanted to apologize, ma'am. Not just for what I said about you, but for what I thought about you. I had no right to judge your service or your character based on my own ignorance. Elena remained silent, letting him continue. They told us about your missions, Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. About the people you saved, the risks you took, the sacrifices you made. They told us about the school in Kabul, about the children who are alive today because of what you did. Elena could see tears forming in his eyes as he spoke. When they found you after that explosion, you weren't crying or begging like I said. You were unconscious because you had literally been blown through the air while saving 300 kids. And I made jokes about your pain. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. Patterson looked up at her for the first time since approaching. Because I need you to know that I understand now. I understand that everything I thought I knew about courage and sacrifice was wrong. You're everything that a soldier should be, and I'm everything that a soldier should never become." Elena felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for this man who had caused her so much pain. He was young, probably no more than 25, and she could see that learning the truth about her service had genuinely changed him. "Patterson," she said gently, "do you know why I didn't press charges against you?" He shook his head. "Because I believe that people can learn from their mistakes," Elena continued. "Because I think you're a better person than the actions you took in this place. And because I hope that you'll use this experience to become the kind of soldier that this country needs." Patterson's composure finally broke, and tears began streaming down his face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, ma'am. I don't deserve anything from you except your contempt." "Maybe," Elena said, "but contempt won't help anyone. What will help is if you take what you've learned here and use it to make sure this never happens to another soldier." Patterson wiped his eyes and stood up straighter. "I swear to you, ma'am, that I will spend the rest of my career making up for what I did here. I will teach every recruit I meet about respect and honor, and what it really means to serve." Elena nodded. "That's all any of us can do, Patterson. Learn from our mistakes and try to do better." As Patterson walked away, Elena felt a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. The anger and resentment that had been building inside her for weeks had transformed into something more positive. She had taken a situation that could have destroyed careers and turned it into an opportunity for growth and education. The next morning, as she prepared to leave the blacksite facility forever, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had arrived as a broken prisoner, mocked and humiliated by people who saw her as weak. She was leaving as a recognized hero, with the respect and admiration of the same people who had once tormented her. But more importantly, she had learned something about the power of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. Even in the darkest places, people could change and grow if given the chance. The military transport that carried Elena away from the blacksite felt like a spaceship, taking her to another planet. After weeks in concrete rooms with no windows, the view of mountains and desert stretching to the horizon was almost overwhelming. She pressed her face against the small window and watched the facility shrink to a tiny dot behind them. General Webb had accompanied her on the flight to Germany, using the travel time to brief her on what would happen next. The partial declassification of her service record was already causing waves through the military hierarchy. "There are people in Washington who are very interested in meeting you," Webb told her as they flew over the Atlantic Ocean. "Your story has reached some very high levels of government." Elena felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about the attention. She had spent so many years working in the shadows that the idea of public recognition felt foreign and uncomfortable. "What exactly are they planning to declassify?" she asked. Webb opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "The basics of your most significant operations, without the tactical details that could compromise future missions. The number of lives saved, the threats neutralized, the decorations earned. Enough to show the world what kind of soldier you really are." Elena looked through the papers and felt a strange disconnection from the accomplishments listed there. Seeing her entire career summarized in cold official language made it seem like someone else's life. "There's going to be a ceremony," Webb continued, "at the Pentagon. The president wants to personally present you with the decorations that have been sitting in a vault for the past decade." Elena nearly choked on her coffee. "The president?" Webb smiled at her shocked expression. "Elena, do you have any idea how rare it is for someone to have the kind of service record you've built? There are generals who have served for 30 years without accomplishing half of what you've done. You're going to be the face of everything that's good about the American military." The medical facility in Germany was like a luxury hotel compared to the blacksite. Elena had her own room with a television, internet access, and a phone that she could use to call anyone she wanted. The doctors who examined her were amazed at how well her wounds had healed, despite the lack of proper medical care during her imprisonment. "You have an incredible pain tolerance," Dr. Schmidt told her during one of her examinations. "Most people would have been screaming for medication with injuries like these." Elena didn't tell him that the physical pain from her wounds was nothing compared to some of the things she had endured during her covert operations. She had learned long ago to compartmentalize suffering and push through discomfort when the mission required it. While she recovered, Elena spent her time reading news articles about her situation that were beginning to appear in military publications. The story of the decorated war hero who had been held and mistreated due to bureaucratic failures was generating significant interest among military personnel and veterans groups. What surprised Elena most was the number of messages she received from other female soldiers who had heard about her story. Many of them shared their own experiences of being underestimated or disrespected because of their gender, despite their qualifications and accomplishments. One message that particularly moved her came from a young lieutenant named Sarah Martinez. Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to thank you for showing us what's possible. I'm a helicopter pilot and I've faced a lot of doubts about whether women belong in combat roles. Knowing that someone like you has been out there protecting our country for all these years gives me hope that I can make a difference too. Elena realized that her story had implications far beyond her own experience. By revealing her service record, the military was also making a statement about the capabilities and contributions of women in combat roles. Dr. Schmidt cleared her for travel after a week of treatment, and Elena found herself on another military transport, this time heading to Washington, D.C. The closer they got to the capital, the more nervous she became about the attention that awaited her. General Webb seemed to sense her anxiety. You know, Elena, you've faced down terrorists and enemy soldiers without flinching. I think you can handle a few politicians and reporters. Elena laughed despite her nerves. It's different when you can shoot back. When they landed at Andrews Air Force Base, Elena was surprised to see a small crowd of people waiting for her arrival. There were military officials, government representatives, and even some reporters with cameras. For someone who had spent her career avoiding attention, the reception was overwhelming. As she walked down the aircraft steps, Elena noticed a familiar figure in the crowd. Patterson was standing at attention in his dress uniform, looking nervous but determined. Next to him were several other guards from the blacksite facility. General Webb followed her gaze and smiled. I thought you might want to see them again. They requested permission to attend your ceremony tomorrow. Elena walked over to where Patterson was standing. He saluted her formally and she could see that his hands were shaking slightly. Ma'am, I wanted to be here to see you receive the recognition you deserve, Patterson said. I also wanted to thank you for the chance to learn from my mistakes. Elena looked at the group of young soldiers who had traveled across the country to witness her moment of triumph. A month ago, these same men had been mocking her wounds and questioning her courage. Now they stood before her with genuine respect and admiration. Thank you for coming, Elena told them. Your presence here means more to me than you know. As they drove toward the Pentagon, Elena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a prisoner, been revealed as a hero, and was now about to become a symbol of service and sacrifice for the entire military. Tomorrow, she would receive the public recognition that had been denied to her for so many years. But tonight she was simply grateful to be alive and proud of the woman she had become through all the challenges she had faced. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright over Washington, D.C. Elena stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, adjusting her dress uniform for what felt like the 100th time. The rows of ribbons and badges on her chest told only part of her story, but today the world would learn about the rest. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned on the few decorations that had always been visible in her official record. In a few hours, she would receive the medals that had been hidden away for over a decade, recognition for missions that officially never happened, and heroism that had been buried in classified files. General Webb knocked on her door at exactly 8 o'clock, as punctual as always. When Elena opened it, she was surprised to see that he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was an older woman in civilian clothes with kind eyes and graying hair. Elena, I'd like you to meet someone very special, Webb said with a smile. This is Maria Santos, the principal of the school in Kabul that you saved. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never met any of the people whose lives she had touched during her covert operations. The missions had always ended with her disappearing back into the shadows, never knowing the faces of those she had protected. Ms. Rodriguez, Maria said in accented English, stepping forward to embrace Elena. I flew here from Afghanistan to thank you personally. Because of what you did, 300 children went home safely that day. Because of your sacrifice, they are still alive, still learning, still dreaming about their futures. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she hugged this woman who represented so many of the innocent people she had spent her career protecting. "I was just doing my job," Elena said quietly. "No," Maria replied firmly. "You were doing something much more important than a job. You were proving that there are still people in this world who will risk everything to protect others." The drive to the Pentagon was surreal. Elena sat in the back of an official vehicle, watching the familiar landmarks of Washington pass by the window. She had been to the Pentagon many times before for classified briefings, but never as the guest of honor at a public ceremony. When they arrived, Elena was amazed by the size of the crowd that had gathered. The ceremony was being held in the Pentagon's center courtyard, and every seat was filled with military personnel, government officials, family members of soldiers, and representatives from veterans groups. As Elena was escorted to her seat in the front row, she spotted Patterson and the other guards from the blacksite sitting together in the audience. Patterson caught her eye and nodded respectfully. She could see that he was wearing the ribbon of a commendation for educational service. Apparently, he had already been recognized for his work training new recruits. The ceremony began with the traditional military pomp and protocol. Elena listened as various speakers talked about her service record, her courage under fire, and her dedication to protecting innocent lives. It felt strange to hear her own story told in such glowing terms after so many years of secrecy. When the president took the podium, the entire courtyard fell silent. Elena had met presidents before during classified briefings, but this was different. This time, she was here as herself, not as a shadow operative whose existence could never be acknowledged. "Today we honor a true American hero," the president began. "Elena Rodriguez represents the very best of our military, our values, and our commitment to protecting freedom around the world. For 15 years, she has served in the shadows, asking for no recognition and receiving no public praise for accomplishments that would make headlines if they were known." The president gestured toward Elena, who stood and walked to the podium. As she approached, she could see hundreds of faces looking back at her with respect and admiration. For someone who had spent her career avoiding attention, the experience was both thrilling and terrifying. "Elena Rodriguez has eliminated 47 high-value targets, prevented 3 major terrorist attacks, and saved countless innocent lives," the president continued. "She has been wounded in action multiple times, captured and tortured by enemy forces, and faced dangers that most of us can't imagine. Through it all, she has maintained her honor, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to the mission." One by one, the president presented Elena with the medals she had earned but never received. The Silver Stars for extraordinary heroism under fire, the Bronze Star for meritorious service in combat, the Purple Hearts for wounds received in action, and finally, the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. As each medal was pinned to her uniform, Elena thought about the missions that had earned them. The late-night raids on terrorist strongholds, the weeks spent behind enemy lines gathering intelligence, the moments when she had to choose between her own safety and the mission objectives, always choosing the mission. But she also thought about the cost of that service. The relationship she had never been able to maintain because of the secrecy surrounding her work, the normal life she had given up to serve in the shadows, the friends and teammates who hadn't made it home from some of those missions. When the ceremony concluded, Elena was surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Veterans who understood the weight of the medals she wore, young soldiers who saw her as an inspiration for their own careers, civilians who were grateful to know that people like her were protecting them. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself standing alone with General Webb in the quiet courtyard. "How does it feel?" Webb asked. "To finally have your service recognized?" Elena looked down at the medals on her chest and then back up at the Pentagon building where so many important decisions about national security were made every day. "It feels strange," she admitted. "For so long, the secrecy was part of who I was. The idea that people know about my missions feels like a fundamental change in my identity." Webb nodded understandingly. "You don't have to go back to covert operations if you don't want to. With your experience and your new public profile, you could have your pick of assignments. Training, intelligence analysis, strategic planning. The world is open to you now." Elena considered this. The idea of a normal military career with regular hours and no more hiding in the shadows was tempting. But she also knew that there were still threats out there, still innocent people who needed protection, still missions that required someone with her particular skills. "I need some time to think about it," Elena said finally. As she walked toward the waiting car that would take her to the reception dinner, Elena felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a young girl, maybe 10 years old, standing with her parents. "Are you the lady who saved the school?" the girl asked with wide eyes. Elena knelt down to the girl's level. "I helped keep some children safe, yes. My daddy says you're a hero," the girl continued. "He says you protect people like me." Elena felt her heart swell with emotion. This was why she had made all the sacrifices, endured all the pain, spent all those years in the shadows, so that children like this could grow up safe and free, never knowing how close they had come to danger. "Your daddy is right," Elena said softly. "There are people all over the world whose job it is to keep you safe. We do it because children like you are the most important thing in the world." As Elena stood up and watched the little girl walk away with her parents, she knew what her decision would be. The medals on her chest were nice. The recognition was gratifying. But the real reward was knowing that there were children somewhere who were alive and safe because of the work she had done. Elena Rodriguez, the living legend who had been mocked in the shadows of a blacksite, was ready to return to those shadows if that's what it took to keep protecting the innocent. Some heroes were meant to be celebrated in the light, but others were meant to work in the darkness, asking for nothing more than the knowledge that their sacrifice mattered. The general had been right about one thing. She was a living legend. But legends, Elena had learned, were most powerful when people believed in them, without necessarily knowing all the details of how they came to be.